This was my patch as a wee boy. The Shankill. I won't be the only person from round here who resents the name of the Shankill being welded to the worst gang of serial killers in British history. A gang that gruesomely lived up to their name. The Shankill Butchers.
It shamed the Shankill community. It shamed it.
He was practically decapitated.
Saw the body lying several yards up on the waste ground. Walked towards it. I knew it was another one.
Had these victims been Protestants, this would never have been allowed to go on for as long as it did.
In my opinion, they shouldn't have been called the Shankill Butchers. They were murdering thugs.
That fact runs through thousands of pages of evidence. 40 years on, we've been given unique access to that evidence. And the man who caught the Shankill Butchers speaks publicly for the first time.
We didn't go after loyalist paramilitaries or Republican paramilitaries. We went after killers.
There's one question that cries out from the evidence, as it does from the victims' families who've never spoken out before. How did the Shankill Butchers get away with it for so long? Hello there, how you doing? Yes. Doing alright. I was just 6 when the Shankill Butchers were convicted in 1979. The savage murders they carried out were the talk of the road at a time of everyday brutality. 1972 saw the highest death toll of the Troubles in 1 year. Nearly 500 people were killed. In January, Bloody Sunday was seared into the memory. Horror followed upon horror. Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries killed at will. In July, 20 IRA bombs exploded in central Belfast in what became known as Bloody Friday. 9 were killed, 130 injured.
Events like Bloody Friday, I think, was a big watershed. After that, the Troubles began to get more and more and more vicious. A lot of men joined the organisations thinking this was the only way they could defend their own community. And I had friends who joined at that stage with that sole intention that if the IRA was going to blow up the bus stations and all, we better get ready for a war.
The paramilitary underworld became a breeding ground for violence. Power struggles between the UDA and the UVF were rampant.
I think from then on there was a fear coming into the Protestant community that perhaps we had unleashed something that we would find very, very difficult to curtail.
2 months after the Belfast bombings, a 32-year-old Protestant called William Edward Pavis was murdered in one such feud. The killer who shot him in the head in broad daylight was almost certainly this man, Lenny Murphy. How Murphy got away with it tells us a lot about the man who went on to mastermind the killings of the Shankill Butchers. Murphy was charged alongside his getaway driver, Mervyn Connor. He named Murphy as the killer. Amazingly, they were put on the same wing in Crumlin Road Jail. But just 2 months before the trial, Murphy's major accuser was dead, killed by cyanide. Beside him, an apparent suicide note. Now, this is a copy of the note, and it's never been made public before. To whom it may concern, during my time in prison, I've done nothing but think what I've done to the fellow called and the names redacted. We know Mervyn Connor is writing about Murphy. Here, on the day he was poisoned, he says naming Murphy as the killer was a lie he couldn't live with. The police conclusion? Murphy made sure he didn't have to.
It was common knowledge that Murphy had been responsible for Connor's death.
Common knowledge?
A very, very extremely cunning man. Could adjust to any circumstances in which he found himself. Murphy probably threatened to kill him if he didn't do it. He was totally ruthless and sadistic. And if he had been involved in the murders that he was suspected of Pavis and Connors, then he would be capable of almost anything.
In June 1973, Murphy was acquitted of the Pavis murder. For the next 2 years, Murphy built on his reputation for utter ruthlessness. He was just 23, but already he was thought to have murdered as many as 10 people. And he also set up his own unit. Its unofficial headquarters was here, Longbrook Avenue, right in the heart of the Shankill. Murphy recruited 3 henchmen, and they all had one thing in common: a deep-seated hatred of Catholics. 25-year-old Robert Basher Bates was a petty criminal and had been in and out of Borstal throughout his childhood. 20-year-old Sam McAllister was another young offender with a reputation for violence. The third of Murphy's henchmen was 25-year-old William Moore. He drove a black taxi. He had also worked as a meat packer and had access to a set of butcher's knives. About 12 others passed through the gang, but these 3 members, Moore, McAllister and Bates, they were Lenny Murphy's hardcore.
He controlled them absolutely. No one in the circle talked. The fear that he instilled in them made sure that they didn't talk. No one knew about their activities. No one was allowed in the Longbrook Club when they were discussing tactics. It was a completely closed shop.
But being a player in the mainstream loyalist underworld wasn't enough for Murphy. He was determined to unleash a level of sectarian savagery never before seen in Northern Ireland. Murphy was about to up the ante. Big time. On the 25th of November 1975, the body of Frank Crossan, a North Belfast Catholic, was discovered by a Shankill resident. It was about 100 yards down that street in an entry.
We saw this horrendous wound in the throat of the man. The blood was still oozing. It was absolutely grotesque.
Frank Crossan had been practically decapitated.
He was attacked, hit over the head with a wheel brace and pulled into a waiting car. He was driven to an alleyway on the Shankill Road and his throat was cut. It was different. It was so savage, so barbaric. We would come across people being stabbed, attacks with knives. This man obviously had been overpowered and his throat deliberately slit open. Evil is the only way you could describe it. Just evil.
Frank Crossan's body was dumped almost within sight of Tennant Street Police Station, where Jimmy Nesbitt was head of CID.
This is a report on Francis Joseph Crossan, which was done by me in November 1975. He had cutthroat wounds, a number of cutthroat wounds, some of them quite superficial, but some quite deep, going back to the spine.
Frank Crossan was abducted from an area known as Millfield, at the back of what is now Castle Court Shopping Centre. A series of side streets and alleyways, Millfield gives a shortcut in and out of the city centre.
We went through every possible line of inquiry. Those streets along that area were darkened and deserted.
Nobody saw anything.
There was no one about. There was no one about, and that's why he was abducted.
When police carried out door-to-door inquiries on the Shankill, they say they were met with a wall of silence.
It's all right for outsiders to say, why don't you speak up? Why don't you do this? You don't know if your next door neighbour was involved in this. You don't know what might happen to your kids. You've got to live in the area to know and taste that fear.
So if people had spoken out, what would have happened then?
They probably would have found themselves the victims. And it was very, very few people would have put their head above the parapet in those days, because you're likely to have it cut off. So people just decided, well, there's one other alternative, go in and close the door. These things aren't happening in our name, but we don't have to be part of it.
Close the door and let the murders continue.
Yes.
If you're going up a blind alley and you're going to where a victim was kidnapped and there are no witnesses, there's no evidence, there's no clues, there's nothing to go on. It doesn't matter how many people you have, you can only go to a certain distance.
Less than 2 months after Frank Crossan's murder, Ted McQuaid and his wife were walking home from a party in the north of the city. When they reached the bottom of the Cliftonville Road, the door of a vehicle swung open. A man jumped out and shot Ted McQuaid in the head. His wife could only watch as the murderers sped off into the night. But critically, she was able to tell the police the killers escaped in a black taxi. The police couldn't trace the taxi, and Ted McQuaid's murder was treated as just another sectarian killing. But there were similarities with Frank Crossan's murder. Two Catholics on their way home after a night out. Both within the same 1 mile radius of Millfield. And now a black taxi ferrying the gang. A pattern was emerging. North Belfast was a patchwork of Catholic and Protestant ghettos, some just 1 or 2 streets, creating dozens of interfaces and flashpoints. During the Troubles, more murders were investigated here than anywhere else in Northern Ireland.
The patch covered right from North Street, right up the Shankill Road, up the Ballygomartin Road, up the Crumlin Road, right up to Lake O'Neill. It was an area of approximately 15 square miles, about 150,000 people.
Brendan Brown's family ran a Catholic social club in Millfield. During the 70s, anyone walking through the warren of side streets and alleyways near his bar was usually heading towards a Catholic area of North Belfast.
Protestants just wouldn't have walked around this district.
So if you were wanting to kill a Catholic, it was very easy to identify one?
Yeah, just anybody walking around here was a take. I was seen as a take, that's just the way it was.